Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us to what anchor institutions should know about affordable housing. I'm Tony Sorrentino. I'm kind of the facilitator of this several session course about what we as anchor planners, anchor leaders need to know, should know about affordable housing as a field and a topic, and what the role of the anchor is in maybe increasing the supply or preserving the supply, and all the different dynamics that go into that. Session 1, 2, and 3 are all available for you to watch if you've missed them, or for your own inventory to draw upon of lessons. We've looked at the history of the anchor institution movement. We've looked at the past and present of housing policy as it relates to housing that made affordable. Our last session was with a private real estate developer who articulated the many ways the private sector engages in this field and how one goes about increasing the supply through that. And I'm really thrilled to have my friend Octavia Howe from the Pew Trusts here in the great city of Philadelphia join us today. You've been given her bio in advance, so I'm not going to read it, so we have more time to get into the substance of it. But when I thought about this particular session, Octavia was the one that came to mind. And I reached out to her randomly and cold on an email and said, I'm doing this thing. Would you help us out? Because not only are you a planner who thinks like a planner, but an urbanist who cares about cities, but you've got a big policy brain and you love data. And I think what anchor leaders ought to know if they're going to be making policy suggestions to their presidents, they've got to be able to make an argument that's also rooted in data, not just advocacy. And so with that, Octavia, I think you've got screen sharing capacity. Everyone's got your bio. You've got a set of slides, and you're going to walk us through how one goes about collecting neighborhood data, how one uses it, and tell us everything. I think these people want to know what you know, and we're glad to have you with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Was muted. Thanks so much, Tony. Really happy to be able to present to this group. I'm excited that you're excited about this and have been engaged, and when you're not able to make it, looking, checking in on the Zooms. I think, I'm an urbanist. My background is in city planning. I love cities, I love places, and the role of institutions is really interesting to me. But as Tony mentioned, I also love data. I also love maps, which that I will I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that this is probably the only presentation I've done in years that does not have a map in it. So I lament that, but I think maps are one of those things that's really useful to tell the story of what's happening in place. And so to get you guys started, I really just wanted to launch into this question, which is, where should I begin? I think when you're dealing with, a place and trying to understand what it is that you would like to influence in your city, how you want to approach housing, and where should you start with data, it can be really, really overwhelming. There's lots of things to consider. There's lots that that can become too much. And so I've kind of laid out a few steps to begin. And the first thing is not go to census.gov. Because if you go to census.gov as your first stop, you'll get overwhelmed. You'll probably get frustrated just because the website is, just a wealth of information, lots of different surveys. You really want to start with your questions. And I think a lot of those questions would have already been raised in the weeks prior till now. But you want to think about like really basic demographics, like what's the population of your city? Is it big? Is it small? Is it growing? Who lives here? I think you want to think about, lots of dimensions across who is living in a place. So there's things like race, things like ethnicity, but also income. What are the sources of income? Are there people who live here, the people who work in my institution? Are the people who live here the people who attend my institution? How old are they? What is it that they need? What's their level of education? One thing that's really interesting when you think about sort of operating in place is you want to think about how people get to the places that they're going. And so we often talk about housing as this, standalone thing, but it's really, really not. And we all know this based on the way we live our lives. I think often about the housing and transportation connection. You'll hear people talk about them as a construct of housing and transportation together. Also, maybe housing and energy. How much are people spending both the getting back and forth to work, but also in heating and cooling their homes? How do energy costs impact their housing? And also education. There's obviously what can I afford based on what my education is, but also how's the school down the street? And so, like Tony has probably already talked to you guys about how Penn made an investment in the school next door to really think about housing. And so, as you're considering your housing plan, I think you'll want to understand these baseline demographics of the city that's around you to understand the challenges that people are facing. And those are kind of like your really quick, high level hits before you really start to dig in and sink into like, well, what do I want to know? What do we want to do in this space and what's relevant? And I start with these types of questions just because it's really easy to just get started. But I find that when I'm starting a new research project, I always start with number one, asking a bunch of questions of myself. I have a few here, but like my question list can go 50 long, maybe not 50, but really digging in because one question tends to lead to another. And I ask myself those questions. I try to not with data analysis, but with just my understanding of a place, maybe reading articles, looking at reports that have come out. What is the nuance that I need to understand here? And then talking to folks. And so you see, I've asked here, what are the questions, what are the issues that are important to nearby residents? And that is not a thing that you can really know on your own, even when you do that work of doing, your preliminary research. Really, if it's possible, if you have the green light to do so, you want to start by asking residents, what's happening in your city or in this community, and not necessarily rooted in the context of your institution. You may hear a lot about your institution and its role, but you really just want to know, what are people dealing with? What's important to the mayor, or whoever is the leader of your city. If it's a city manager or a council person that has the most influence, what are their priorities? I think in general, but also obviously as it connects to housing. You want to think about things like, is this community grappling with development pressure? So in Philadelphia, you've got a range of issues that are happening like in the different institutions, or around, I should say, the different institutions in our city. If you're looking around University of Pennsylvania right now, you have pressure. Lots of people want to build there. The institution is exerting its influence in a good way, where you're seeing, restoration of buildings, new things going up, students living nearby. In other parts of the city, we're still grappling with disinvestment, where we still have vacancy that is, a major push that people are wanting to resolve, deterioration of buildings. And so thinking about what's happening in the local economy, what's happening in the local job market in your city. Are there major shifts in the environment or demographics? Some of you may be operating in cities that, or in towns or counties. I tend to be biased towards cities just because I live in one, but I know that lots of institutions are in smaller places. But are you thinking about climate change? Are you thinking about a short or long-term horizon where the buildings that people are living in are less able to sustain increased heat? Is cooling now an issue where it might not have been? Are you worried about floodwaters? So I think really just getting into a real good question mode is where I like to start. I have two things highlighted in blue, or two bullet points. So your general questions, and then your like the relevant issues. And I think one of the things to focus on is, how is the demographics of my institution? Are they the same? Are they different than the institution that's around us? Because that's something that's really going to shape what your relationship looks like and your perception of the need, and also can give you some clues to how the community may be perceiving you. I think another thing is to really think about the positive and negative impact your institution has had or is having on the community that's surrounding. And sometimes we think about just the near neighbors next door, but it may be on your overall county. In Philadelphia, our institutions don't have to pay property taxes. What's the impact of that? So really thinking about those types of questions, I think, is a really important thing to do. And then just the history. If you're doing it for the first time, you may or may not be the first. During years ago, there's books. Of course, I'm not drawing the name of a recent book that came out, I think last year, where they were just really looking at the history of universities in particular in urban spaces and the ways in which universities sort of closed off to cities as they were changing, as this investment was happening. So understanding that history vis-a-vis your institution is important. And so those are some of the places where I think you should start before you crack open a website or check out a population number. So then, similar on the same vein, you want to familiarize yourself with things that are important on a national context. Um, there are often one of the reasons why I like to do this is because that can give you a clue where you can get support, where you might have, people on your boards or members of your faculty who are already taking an interest there. And I think that that's just really helpful and potentially tapping in to resources because even though many institutions have endowments and lots of resources, I think it's just easier when you're not going it alone. And so understanding what's happening in the field, what are folks interested in, I think is really important. So some of the things that are really trending right now is the fact that housing units have expiring subsidies. So there's lots of different ways that affordable housing has been funded over the years, but most of them have affordability time horizon. So, after 20 years, then this is allowed to, not have to be affordable anymore. After 30 years, those types of things. And so lots of places are really interested in where subsidies are expiring as a way to understand the need to protect long-term affordability or even just to be aware of a potential change on horizon. Folks are also really interested, and this is goes beyond the affordable housing realm in a lot of ways, housing shortages. And so you'll see more buzz lines now talking about there not being enough housing to go around across the country. And one of the ways that people are interested in addressing that is zoning reform. So in places that have more suburban character or more rural character, and the way that that character is enforced is by having restrictive zoning. So like you can't build something on less than an acre. Those types of things are being, questioned and challenged across the nation in lots of cities and suburban areas. Cost burden is something that is probably not trending because it's new, but trending because it's a little bit over evergreen. Are people able to afford the housing that they live in? The standard in US is really a household shouldn't be spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and that includes their rent and their utilities, and like if they were a homeowner, their insurance and property taxes. So all in, if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, that's a problem. And so that's the type of thing that you might explore in terms of demographics. And so there's a list here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but really thinking about what's happening across the country. I have linked here just an article that's kind of going over. It's an article from Brookings under the currently trending. You see the hyperlink there. It's really just kind of talking about some of the things that people are thinking about nationally. But doing that type of digging, I think, is a helpful place to begin. Um, and then kind of getting more into as you get ready to do analysis, we at Pew, or particularly I at Pew, like to compare Philadelphia. So I guess I didn't really give you any amount of overview, but I do a lot of housing research in Philadelphia for Pew. And when I do that, we do our best to try to compare Philadelphia to other places that are like Philadelphia. And for a long time, it was big cities. And Philadelphia is a big city, but it has a lot of things that are not like big cities. Like we're not New York. Our population is a fraction the size of New York. Our wealth is a fraction the size of New York. And so it's important for us to think about what's really important in our context. And so we've started to think about different ways that we compare. So one thing is we started to look at cities that are Rust Belt cities that have similar poverty rates to ours, that have similar demographic composition. For us, even like how they're governed. Philadelphia is a city that is a city and a county. And so that has a lot of impact on how we are able to do business. And so as you're thinking for your institution, both in thinking about what other types of universities or institutions you would want to compare to, you'd also want to think about what types of places you'd want to compare to and how are they similar to yours so that you can say, we're doing as well as the benchmark, not as good, better than. And I think there's also always a tendency to look at the national context, but keep in mind that often what's happening at the nation just really might not be relevant to what's happening at your place. And so you don't want to get into a place where you're comparing yourself apples and oranges. You really want to think about, as close to, similar fruit to your institution as possible. Um, so I said a lot, lots of questions. Like I said, I'd have a list of questions 50 long. After saying all of that, I would emphasize you don't want to try to boil the ocean. Ultimately, a lot of the reports that we have done that have been effective have focused on a single issue. We focus on a single place. And yes, we compare to other places, but we don't get into the business of like doing deep dives in other places. And so as you're approaching this work and figuring out what's important, try to figure out what's most important or two or three things that are most important and not get caught up in doing demographic analysis for a bunch of different metrics. And so here's some of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of getting into the data. So one of the things that I like to start with, I love administrative data. Administrative data is one of those things that an institution has access to that lots of places don't. I've always been really interested in things like, where do your employees live? When you're thinking about housing, it's useful to think about both who's around you, that the community, the natural community that has existed outside of your walls, but also how are you interacting with that? And one of the things to know is, are my staff members, so is your janitor able to live nearby? Is it beneficial for them to live there nearby? Is your faculty living nearby? Are your students living nearby? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? So thinking about your relationship to the neighborhood in that way. And that data is available in your HR office, in your admissions office. You know where people are coming from. You know what they can afford. I think obviously you have to go through the proper channels to keep confidentiality there, but there's a really rich resource to think about what data do we have on our own. If you're looking outside of your institution, and I think even if you're looking inside of your institution, one of the things you want to think about is the reliability of your data. Not all data is created equal. A lot of it is garbage. And if you make recommendations based on garbage data, then your recommendations are going to be of a similar character. And so you really want to understand, how is this data collected? How often is it collected? Is there bias in the ways that the data was collected? If I only sent this survey out to people who are connected to the president of the university, being, super unrealistic there, you're not going to get data that's really emblematic of the community. And so when you're looking at data that you're examining, you want to understand, how did they make it? Where did it come from? Who was responsible for it? I have a tendency to really like to look at data dictionaries. It's a really geeky thing. It feels overwhelming. It feels like a thing that is too in the weeds. But when you take the time to see, like, what does this thing mean when they say, poverty, what does that mean? When they say cost burden, what does that mean? Really understanding those things really help you to understand your data, be confident in what it's saying, and be able to explain it. And I think so those are some of the things I really recommend is when you're exploring a data source is to know how it was made, understand the data dictionary. And then this kind of harkens back to my prior point about not wanting to boil the ocean. You really want to think about simple tools and simple methods. A lot of, I write big reports about Philadelphia. I deal with data that is, millions of records sometimes, but I often am just using Excel to do my analysis. I'm looking at percentages. I'm looking at what's the average, what's the median. 50% are above this level, 50% are below. What's changed? How has it changed over time? Those types of questions are really the most impactful ones to understand. Sometimes it feels like you need to do like a regression analysis or do a cohort model. None of that is really what's going to resonate with the people who you're trying to influence. Really, just being able to give you a total. This is our total population that is living around our community or living around our institution, that these are the percentage of the people who live here who also or who work here who also live nearby. Those types of things are really impactful. So I think keeping it simple is one of like the biggest pieces of advice. I have like a list of data sources that I'm going to pull up in a second, and if you click through them, you will drown in all the data that's available. And so you don't want to really get caught up in the answering question after question after question, which is why that first set of what's important, why do I want to know it, what is in our institution's interest, what do we want to solve for? Those questions are really useful to ground you, because if you're anything like me, or if the people in your team are anything like me, you can get just kind of like chasing butterflies, looking at little pieces of nuanced data that just aren't really the thing that's going to move the needle. And then finally, I would recommend that you just don't go it alone. Some data, like I said, if you can go to the census website and get a simple table, if you have, simple data from your organization and you can work with it in Excel, great. Go have at it. And that's the best way to do it. And like I said, that can be extremely impactful. But there's some data that you're going to be interested in that's more complicated. You might want to know about an age group that the census doesn't break it down at that level. You might want to know about an income group that is, specialized. And those sorts of things require the use of either specialized data. So we often look at public use microdata. And microdata comes from all different types of organizations. And what that is basically, instead of getting their 3,000 people in this place and 10% of them are this race, 20% are that race, it's giving you a data set with 3,000 records, and you can go through and see what are their characteristics. That can be really overwhelming. And so I really love the advice to look to other people who are already doing this stuff. When you want to get to the nitty gritty, when you want to go beyond the base level data. I have highlighted here state data centers. The Census Bureau has a network of data center providers where they basically will go in and analyze local data. They make dashboards. They will look at projections for population change, all kinds of digesting the census information in a way that you don't have to. And they also are often available to pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm looking at this piece of information. Am I understanding it correctly? Can you help me with it? And depending on how friendly or how swamped they are, they may be willing to do individual data pulls for you as well. Federal Reserve banks are also a really interesting and kind of off the beaten path source of data. Often they are doing data collection, data analysis. The thing I'm gonna ask Tony to circulate the list so that you guys, or this PowerPoint, so you can click through to the links. But I think there's like 13, there's more than a dozen Federal Reserve banks across the country. And they often will have like really custom analyses that you can access and be able to get data without having to do the math yourself. And then finally, thinking about what are the resources within your institution. Um, there are often students who are, they sociology students, planning students, math majors that are familiar with these bigger data tools, that you might need in order to go deep, that you can use as resources. So don't think that this has to stay in, the planning unit, like strategic. I don't know the units that you all are in, but it doesn't necessarily have to stay in that administrative side. Think about ways where you can leverage the expertise that exists within your institution. And then I think the last substantive slide is really just giving you a readout of some of the data sources that I've used. I've mentioned a bunch of times the Census Bureau. I use the American Community Survey all the time. The decennial census comes out every 10 years. They changed it a bit where really it's the American Community Survey is the main data source. It is a sample data. So every 10 years, they ask everybody in the country to be counted. But in the years between, they ask a smaller number of people a more detailed list of questions about themselves. And that's where you'll get into things like how much are you spending on housing? Or do you live with a grandparent? Or um, how much are your energy costs? Those types of things are you'll get from the American Community Survey. And that goes down to a really granular level where you can find out data in like a block group. So in, maybe the 10 blocks surrounding your institution, or into these larger areas where you get less geographic detail, but more granular information, where it's like a Puma area where it's, I'm not sure what the threshold is of how many people are in there, but like in Philadelphia, for example, we're about, 1.5-ish million people in the city. We have 11 Puma areas covering our city. And so the Census Bureau is great. If we have time, I can kind of show you just the interface there. They've tried to make it simple for you to see where you can go in and say population of Denver and get population tables. Sometimes it's easier than other times to like if you want to get like block group data or track level data, it can be a little trickier. But some of the big top line, how many how many owner occupied units are in this town, that's easy to pull. Another one that's really great, like as I mentioned, I love maps, is Policy Map. You can get really great data and mapping from that website. There's a free version, and then you can get more details if you use the paid version, but it'll give you a lot of information, like that idea of like data dictionaries and understanding like what is it. It's a reliable source of data and data aggregation. Um, and then I think another one that's really useful is, I'm going to skip down, is the National Housing Preservation Database. That one is one where they will tell you all of the units that are subsidized in your geographic location, and it's really useful if you want to understand how many light tech units are there, how many affordable units are nearby, and trying to get into things like, are they expiring? That is a really useful data set for that. You have to register for it, but you shouldn't have any problem with your affiliations getting into that data. It's not, super crazy to get in. And then Zillow also has great data. HMDA also makes data available about home mortgages and understanding who's purchasing mortgages. Once you get into HMDA, then that's kind of where you want help because those are bigger data sets. The HUD user portal has a bunch of great data, but it's also complicated as you get down into that website. So I wanted to link it there just so you know that it's there, but that's where it starts to get a little bit more difficult. And the other thing you kind of see that I clicked on it recently is open data portals. And so many cities, there's been a movement in the past a dozen or so years to focus on making data available to a wider swath of the population. And so you'll see that I think there are about 150 or so open data portals that the census has cataloged. And I wanted to go to the census website just because, like I said, there's lots of junk data and there's lots of spammy kind of data that you don't want to go to. And so this kind of links you to like, what is your local open data? So there'll be like open data New York, open data North Carolina, the state or the city, and it just depends. And so all those things are kind of linked at that website. And the last thing I'll mention, if you want to go deep, which if you're just getting started, I don't recommend. um, but if you do want to go deep, you'll need tools like 7-Zip. A lot of times when you're getting a really big data set, you'll need to unzip it. And you can use your Windows zip unzipping tool, but sometimes you need something that deals with different types of data sets. So 7-Zip is what I use a lot. If you wanted to use like open source software to analyze large data sets, R is really a great one. You don't have to pay for it. And there's a big user community out there that talks about how they do data analysis. And then if you want to do maps, there's ArcMap is kind of the tried and true. You can also use R, which, as I said, is free to make maps. Tableau is really great for visualizing data, both in maps and also tables and, pie charts and such. And as I mentioned, Policy Map is also a great one where you can sort of make customized maps without you having to be the one that's really in it. So that's kind of my high flyover of data analysis, how to approach it. I hope it's helpful. It's hard to go like deep in the weeds, but I'm also available if you have questions about how to do this kind
Be
of stuff.
careful what you wish for. People might
Yeah, I
start
know.
hitting you up. This was wonderful. I mean, what great insights and what great practical tools and resources and a really great overview for what is available to all of us that we can use. But I think more than that, I really appreciate your framing of this in that we are institutions in a neighborhood and we have to understand the neighborhood data. We are institutions in a neighborhood in a city. We have to understand the city data, but also the city politics. We ought to appreciate the historical context, not just of where we're located, but what we may have done in the past, the people before us. Neighbors have long memories, and then I liked the way that you validated a thought I had years ago in graduate school that understanding regression analysis isn't important and I would never need it in my job. So thank you for validating that.
We use it sometimes, but I've not used it in any of my reports, but some of my colleagues use it. It's just not that. It's not the most critical thing. Average is more important than anything else.
So what we're going to do is, I love when we can break into small groups just to build out our networks a little bit. But what I'm going to do is ask Caitlin to break us into 2 groups of about 7 or 8 right now. And I want you to think about your institutions and ask each other and ask yourselves, based on what you learned from Octavia, if we're starting out and we have to present to the president of the anchor institution or the leader, we want to do an affordable housing strategy and we have this, what kind of data would you think is the most important to begin with? And then we'll get back together again in about 10 minutes. And you can ask Octavia some questions based on what you discussed in your breakout rooms, or ask her to clarify or elucidate anything she did in her talk. But I really think of us as a group of people trying to figure out how anchor institutions are going to increase the supply of affordable housing. And when it comes to data, what should we be thinking about? What should we be starting with? What do we already know? And I want to punctuate the point that our human resources department is sitting on tons of data, all of us, that if you ask nicely and you get it in the right way and you protect it, could really be influential. How much do our people earn? Where do they live? Those kinds of things. So why don't we go into about a 10-minute break? We'll reconvene for the final 10 minutes. I'll ask you to just kind of casually report out what you think some important questions are, or what you talked about as a team. You can designate someone, or there's a small group of us today. We can just kind of shout it out. And if you've got questions for Octavia, that would be a time to ask them. So why don't we go and do that now, and we'll reconvene in 10. For everybody for coming back. Okay, we're back. Great. I hope you all had a good time kind of reconnecting and building out your networks a little bit, and just kind of getting into what your institutions may already collect, what you don't collect, what you'd like to collect, learning from each other a little bit. This is very informal, but is there anyone in the group that wants to volunteer to go first? to ask Octavia a question. We've got her here. She's an expert on data collection. Or is there any insight that came out of your groups that you might want to share to see if other people had kind of similar thoughts or insights? This is the part where we're not calling on anyone, but just kind of opening up the Zoom for people to weigh in.
Well, I can.
Please.
I'm Serrana from Marquette in Milwaukee, and we had every one of us has kind of a little bit of a different
Hmm.
population that we're looking to address, and ours in Milwaukee is really more. We don't have walk to work housing for employees, not just even at the university. We're in a highly dense business heavy area. So we're not a place where there are not jobs, but most of the people who work in the businesses in our community don't live in the neighborhood. So there's a different kind of relationship between the residents and the employees of the area.
Sure.
So our focus has been first on trying to improve public housing in the area, and then focus on walk to work. Others in our group are experiencing real issues for their students who are more increasingly with limited options for traditional housing because developers are coming in and building high-end student housing. So for us, for my boss, the question would be, if we're going to get involved in housing, who is it affordable for? Like that's a question that we have to.
For the anchor to say, are we building this affordable housing as workforce housing for our staff, even some junior faculty? Are we building it to be a landlord for people in the neighborhood who otherwise can't afford it? What is our role, really? And that is the grapple right now. What is the role of a university? We've gotten into this. Octavia, I'm not sure if this has ever come up as you've studied housing, where it might intersect in a college town or a college neighborhood or other large anchors, but any insights on that? If a university were to get into the space, should they focus on just their own community, or is there a way to balance it out between their own community and the neighborhood they're in?
Is that something that I've studied? But I do think that there's validity in both. I think it just depends on how much you're already spilling out into the neighborhood. I think if you're spilling out and impacting the residents around you, then I think that would be my opinion, not the opinion of Pew, but that you have a responsibility to also support the neighborhood with housing. I think you just have to think about what is your actual footprint when you're thinking about like, is this for us or is this for the neighborhoods around? Now, if you're only building housing for your students or only building housing for your faculty, that's likely to create, a public relations challenge. And so I think thinking about what the balance is probably where you begin.
That's interesting. Others in the group, is this an issue that's come up? Do you find yourselves in meetings with colleagues around the table talking about whether or not the university should build housing that's for their workforce? I'm curious, is that coming up? Mary, you look like you nodded your head in the yes. Mary is in New York City at Barnard College.
Mary. Yeah, it's definitely coming up. I think in conversations with Barnard colleagues, there's a great concern about a impending loss of faculty housing units. And to attract faculty to New York City, that is really detrimental because of the cost of living in anywhere in the surrounding area. We're in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and Morningside Heights, abutting Harlem. And I think that that's one challenge. And then our neighbor across the street, Columbia University, that has a spillover problem, I would say, and I'm going to continue to use that. Thank you for that language. Octavia has a spillover problem. Maintains that they are not in the business of providing affordable housing for neighbors throughout the neighborhood. And so it's a real tension. Barnard is a bit landlocked. We don't have the capacity to be able to sort of develop new housing necessarily in the same way. So we're somewhat in this special relationship with our neighbor, and so it's a constant tension.
Yeah, those are good points. Others from the other group, any kind of trends that you're spotting, or questions or insights that you'd like to get from Octavia while we've got her here in the last couple of minutes? Feel free to jump in.
I wonder, Octavia, in any of your research, have you found programs or policies that provide housing supplements without actual units, in terms of housing stipends, salary stipends, that universities are assisting employees or faculty staff in finding housing, but without actually developing or providing the bricks and mortar units?
So from what I've done at Pew, no. But in Philadelphia, we have a program called, I think it's called Home By Now. It's sponsored by the Urban Affairs Coalition, and I believe that Penn participates in it, unless you have your own program at Penn. But it does provide like down payment assistance, where an employer, any large employer, can decide to offer that as a benefit so that folks can purchase a home if in the neighborhood if they like.
Is that an independently run organization? What is it called?
Home By Now. It's Urban Affairs Coalition is the organization that runs it, and that's one of their programs.
They're
But
a
it's really
nonprofit,
seeking, yeah, they're a nonprofit, and they're really seeking partnership with, institutions across the city. So like, I don't know who they're currently partnered with, but any large company that has the capacity to offer that as a benefit is really who their target is.
We do have a professor at Penn. His name is Vincent Reyna, and he spent a little bit of time in the White House recently on sabbatical. And he's been talking about whether or not there can be just a cash outlay to the same value as a voucher, and to give people as a portable benefit to go around. Octavia, have you looked at that program?
No, not through Pew. We haven't looked at that. I think, there's lots of conversations around, different types of cash benefits, and, coming out of the pandemic, Philadelphia definitely explored giving folks, cash to enable them to afford their rent with fewer hoops to jump through. So I think there's definitely benefits to those types of things. The city of Philadelphia is also exploring programs that help, homeowner, or not homeowners, but city employees afford properties. I think finding ways to get money in folks' hands in order to help subsidize the cost of their housing, whether it's for purchase or a longer term subsidy, I think is really an interesting thing worth exploring.
Well, let's give Octavia our thanks for a great session today. Thank you so much. Some really good insights, some really great resources, and a wonderful foundation for all of us as we start to make cases for why and how we can increase affordable housing, or housing that's affordable, whether it be for our workforce at our universities or the neighbors that are around us. This video will get packaged up and will be sent out to all of you, so you can add it to your resources and files. And we'll do that along with Octavia's slides, which she was generous enough to offer. And it's got all those really wonderful links. So that brings us to the conclusion. We've got a next session coming up on June 7th. We're going to get into how we actually package up the case study, how we write it up as a document that we present to our leadership at our institutions to say, we've done the data, we've studied the historical context, we understand our role in the responsibility in the community. What are the best practices for making the case? We have Megan Elenz, professor at Arizona State University, who is a budding leading scholar in America on anchor institutions, and has recently developed several case studies around anchor institutions and affordable housing. So that is the first Friday or second Friday in June, I think. So thanks again. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.